Hello and welcome to part 1 of exploring the structure of behavior by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. So I'm going to be just kind of connecting you to the text itself. We're going to go over quotes from the book. I'm going to give you a little bit of background, connections to Kurt Goldstein, who was extremely influential to this work. And so that's what we're going to do today. So here's a timeline. I have a 4-part series that I just wrapped up on my YouTube channel on the book The Organism by Kurt Goldstein. It was published in 1934 in German. The later edition in English was called The Organism, but the original had a German title that was different. So Merleau-Ponty became aware of this work, became aware of Kurt Goldstein, and he actually arranged for a French translation of The Organism to be published in a series which he was an editor along with Sartre. And so then later, Merleau-Ponty published this book that we're talking about today, The Structure of Behavior, in 1942. So he drew from Goldstein as well as other Gestalt theory co-founders and thinkers excuse me, in this work, and also in his major work that came next, which was The Phenomenology of Perception in 1945. Gestalt was a theme that was really foundational to his thinking in these works, and it continued to be up until his last years of life. So there's published notes that he was working on a work, and it's published under the title Visible and Invisible. I think I have that right. I'd love to, after I work through this work, Phenomenology of Perception, I'd also love to do videos on that. But it's kind of really rough collected notes, so they can see that he was still musing on the idea of Gestalt when he died. Okay, so as I said, today is part 1 of our series just exploring this book. I have the 1963 edition in English, published by Beacon Press, translated by Alden Fisher. So that's what my page numbers are going to correspond to. So today I'm going to be talking about the introduction, which is very brief, just a few pages, and then he gets into part 1 on reflex behavior. And then after this video, next time we'll start on part 2, which is about higher forms of behavior. Part 3 is titled The Physical Order, the Vital Order, the Human Order. And the last, part 4, is the relations of the soul and the body and the problem of perceptual consciousness. So first I'm going to kind of give you some quotes from his introduction, and then I'm going to give you some background on Kurt Goldstein, concepts that came up in The Organism that we're going to see in part 1. So then after that, we'll get into part 1 of this book. So in Merleau-Ponty's introduction to this book, he says, "Our goal is to understand the relations of consciousness and nature, organic, psychological, or even social. By nature, we understand here a multiplicity of events external to each other and bound together by relations of causality." So this is the very beginning of the book. It's a very important statement that just tells you kind of what his intention is with this book. It's very much concerned with questions of causality. There's a lot of key concepts that you might say are central to this book, but I would say that causality is for sure one of the biggest questions at the heart of this book. And also he really sums it up when he says, "Our goal is to understand the relations of consciousness and nature." So I'm going to talk about this in a few slides, but this is the continuation of Kurt Goldstein's chapter in his book on kind of mind and nature. So on the one hand, we have those who want to focus so much on like idealism, consciousness as the fundamental kind of unit of reality, that which is most fundamental to reality, radically kind of subjectivity. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have kind of the idea of nature, you have the idea of a thing, like thingness, realism, objectivity to a radical extent. And so that's what Kurt Goldstein talked about in one of the chapters of his book. It was one of the kind of ultimate theses that he was working towards in his book, is talking about like how can we reconcile consciousness and nature. How can we see them within one whole? Kurt Goldstein. Anyway, I'm going to talk about that in a couple slides. Okay, so yeah, so second bullet point right here. That's where I talk about this. So it's chapter 11 in Goldstein's book, The Organism. Goldstein on humans, he says there's causality and then there's personal factors. So Goldstein started this question of causality that Merleau-Ponty is picking up and continuing with. Goldstein was asking, how do we account for the personal factors that might vary person to person versus how we can't just calculate causality based on, we see this environmental factor, we know this about the person, 2 + 2 = 4. Goldstein says humans are more complex than that, and he wants to bring in existential topics like our ability to kind of say no, to assert self, to have a sense of self, to have courage, to rise above basic instincts like resisting pain. He says, in an existential way, a human being might rise above and tolerate pain if they have a greater purpose or sense of meaning or mission in life. Humans can shape the world. They are not just shaped by their environment. Okay, so yes, as I said, this third bullet point already talked about that. And last bullet point here, it is the dialogue between radical subjectivity, which you might see in like panpsychism, the idea that the mind is fundamental, consciousness is fundamental, versus objectivity. Essentialism, things are fundamental and absolute, they have absolute properties. And so you can put these labels on the debate however you want to. You might identify with a certain label or want to label others a certain way according to definitions. I think they can vary slightly, but some common terms are like physicalism, materialism, vitalism, mechanism. These are all kind of camps. The Gestaltists are a camp in all of this, and really from the beginning of Gestalt theory's founding, this has been the conversation. So this is what Gestalt theory was talking about all the way back with Max Wertheimer, the original founder of Gestalt theory. Okay, so I just kept that quote at the top, the beginning statement in his introduction. So he mentions critical thought. So I am not an expert on this, but I believe that is a reference to kind of like the critical camp, meaning those who I don't know if I'm doing justice to it. I'll read it. It says they say there is nothing in the world which is foreign to the mind. So he kind of contrasts some different camps, and he labels this camp the critical thought. And then he contrasts that with, in biology, kind of prevalent perspective there. He says the situation is not the same in biology. In fact, the discussions concerning mechanism and vitalism remain open. Our picture of the organism is still for the most part that of a material mass. Under these conditions, biological thought most frequently remains realistic. So it remains in that more like essentialist, realist, the camp, the side of the spectrum that sees things as like things, versus those who want to focus on like the mind and consciousness. This camp that he's talking about sees things according to that nature, mind versus nature. So he says, under these conditions, biological thought most frequently remains realistic. So whenever you hear that word realistic in this book, that's what that's referring to, an extreme kind of realism or essentialism. Either by juxtaposing separated mechanisms or by subordinating them to an entelechy, which was a term used by vitalists. All right, so I kept that same quote at the top. So then he talks about what's the status in psychology, what's their perspective in that field on this question. He says, to the extent that it has attempted to be a natural science, psychology has remained faithful to realism and to causal thinking. So he says they're on that side of the spectrum, focusing on it's kind of like this separation of consciousness and nature, without really integrating it. They tend to just see it as bound by causality. To a radical extent. They are realists. They see things as things, as objects, rather than kind of integrating consciousness, mind, and nature in the human person. They don't have that holistic view that the Gestalt theorists do. And really Merleau-Ponty especially likes Goldstein's development of the Gestalt perspective. That's really the holistic, truly holistic kind of view of the human as an organism, which unites mind and nature, unites this tension within the human person. But Merleau-Ponty is saying that that's not the prevalent tendency in the field of psychology. He says, among psychologists, consciousness was distinguished from beings of nature as one thing from another thing, by a certain number of characteristics. The doctrine of Freud applies metaphors of energy to consciousness and accounts for conduct by the interaction of forces or tendencies. So of course, psychology, it pays attention to consciousness, but it defines it in a way that it's like this force, this energy, and it's the interaction of these things. So it's very causal in its conception. He says, thus, among contemporary thinkers in France, there exists side by side a philosophy on the one hand, which makes of every nature an objective unity, constituted vis-a-vis consciousness, and on the other, sciences which treat the organism and consciousness as two orders of reality, and in their reciprocal relation as effects and as causes. Is the solution to be found in a pure and simple return to critical thought? And once the criticism of realistic analysis and causal thinking has been made, is there nothing justified in the naturalism of science, nothing which, understood and transposed, ought to find a place in a transcendental philosophy? So Merleau-Ponty is trying to find kind of a third way between these different camps that he's talking about, between those who want to focus on kind of idealism and those who want to focus on realism. He wants to find a third way and to integrate what is true about all these different perspectives. Continuing in the few pages where he has the introduction, he says, we will come to these questions by starting from below and by an analysis of the notion of behavior. So, as you know, in Gestalt, there's this idea of kind of a bird's eye view, seeing parts in light of the whole. So you don't just build up stackable parts to assemble a whole. You understand the parts by recognizing that the whole cannot be reduced to the parts, cannot be reduced to a sum of just like simply stacked parts, but rather it's a system. So Merleau-Ponty is instead starting his book in part 1. He's going to not be taking that holistic approach, but rather he's going to be asking, okay, if we have this kind of atomistic perspective, a behaviorist kind of perspective, where will that lead us? And he's going to show that it has errors and it doesn't lead us to an adequate understanding. But he says, this notion of behavior is neutral with respect to the classical distinctions between the mental and the physiological, and thus can give us the opportunity of defining them anew. So he says that's the benefit that I see to exploring what this perspective can tell us. It's fairly neutral. He says, by going through behaviorism, one gains at least in being able to introduce consciousness, not as psychological reality, again, realism as a thing or as a cause, but as structure. So it's the title of the book, The Structure of Behavior. Structure is a word that I mentioned we see in Kurt Goldstein's book, The Organism. I mentioned that in my 4-part series. If you want to go back and watch that, highly recommend that you do before you read this book. Before you watch this series, I would go back and check out that playlist. I'll link it in the description. So structure is going to be like kind of this solution that he finds, this word that he wants to propose instead. He says it will remain for us to investigate in part 3 the meaning and the mode of existence of these structures. So as I said, structure was a key term in Goldstein's book, The Organism, and it's closely related to these kind of synonymous, sometimes exchangeable words, terms. So a big term is preferred behavior, constants, nature, or essence of a thing. So all these words, this is part of why I recommend you go and watch my series on the organism, but I'll try to sum it up here because it's very important to understand going into part 1 of this book. Goldstein was basically saying, I am not an essentialist strictly, but I want to talk about relatively the idea of a nature or essence of a thing insofar as we observe patterns. We observe in humans or in organisms these tendencies that we see they tend to strive for some kind of equilibrium, some kind of balance of where their environment is able to meet their needs. It's adequate to their needs. This is what we can know about a thing's nature. It's not like this idea of soul or that everything in a species is exactly the same. But we do see these patterns, relatively constants, relatively speaking, that tells us about a thing's nature. And so it's this word structure is largely kind of synonymous in how it's used with these other words. And it's the fact that a human, say, has a personality. So it's not this rapidly redefined, I'm not radically defined by my environment from one moment to the next. There's something about me that can be kind of seen to be constant regardless of my situation. There might be values, things that are important to me that I will remember, that I'll retain, tendencies of mine that are relatively constant. So it's this ability to have self-regulation within myself that is in some extent autonomous from environment. It's not absolutely autonomous, but there is some sense of kind of autonomy of an inner organization, an inner structure in the human person or in any organism. Okay, so next quote is a very important quote from Kurt Goldstein in The Organism. He says, what we are striving for is to grasp not merely the actual givenness of Gestalt phenomena, but their corresponding objective stimulational factors. What will turn out to be a Gestalt for an organism depends predominantly on the organism's structure. This relates to what I was just saying. He says, to be sure, the structure of the world is not indifferent to it. He says, okay, so the Gestaltists, Max Wertheimer, Kafka, Kohler, they have tended to focus too much on kind of the givenness, these laws of how gestalts form in perception. Goldstein says, I want to pay more attention to, yes, the environment can like be received and perceived according to these ways. But we also have to ask, how does that individual organism, that person who is perceiving phenomenon, how does that influence what's going on? There's an inner field as well as an outer field. So there's an inner structure, and the structure of the environment is also a factor in what's happening. But there's something going on between these two fields, you might say. This is going to be an idea that we will see is very important in the beginning of part 1 of structure of behavior, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. Okay, and so this term preferred behavior, again, this is a quote from Kurt Goldstein in The Organism. Preferred behavior, good gestalt, or whatever one chooses to call it, represents a very definite form of coming to terms of the organism with the world, that form in which the organism actualizes itself according to its nature in the best way. It's a very important quote to remember. All right, so again, this is kind of what I was just describing, but Kurt Goldstein had said in The Organism, tendency toward preferred behavior means self-organization of the system. So that's what I was just saying. The fact that you can see this pattern of behavior indicates that there is some kind of structure or self-organization in myself as a system. I am not moment to moment determined only by my environment. I am not simply reacting in a very basic way to stimuli. It's not merely reflex determined. There's something more complex happening. And so he says the tendency toward preferred behavior is the essential prerequisite for the existence of a definite organism. Again, that's from Kurt Goldstein. And he says, the question is not what we can learn from the reflex for the performances of the organism. The question must rather be stated as, what does the reflex mean viewed from the performances of the whole organism? It's that principle of seeing the parts in light of the whole. You can't just build up your understanding of a human person based on a summation of reflexes put together. There's a larger kind of maybe mission of self-actualization that Kurt Goldstein proposes. The organism is trying to meet its needs in a given situation. It's not simply a stimulus and response. So that's a guiding principle of his, is seeing parts in light of the whole. All right, so now we're going to get into part 1 of The Structure of Behavior by Merleau-Ponty. And so again, I know that you've been getting this from what I've been saying, but I was so struck in doing these videos by how influential, how much overlap there is between Kurt Goldstein's book, The Organism, and this book, especially part 1 of this book, but really the whole thing. I had browsed through this book before, this one by Merleau-Ponty. I had not read The Organism before, and so when I was reading that, I was really making a lot of the connections, seeing that this is what the structure of behavior is really concerned with. So just kind of really wanted to reiterate that but yeah, so talking concretely about this part of the book, part 1, titled Reflex Behavior, he is asking the very same question that Goldstein was. Merleau-Ponty is asking, so here I'm at page 9 in this book. He's describing a situation where I am perceiving like a spot of light. Am I simply passive in responding to the stimuli? Am I simply determined by my environment showing me this light? Or do I have some level of activity in the situation? This is exactly what Goldstein was critiquing the Gestaltists for not taking into enough account of it. that it is more than just given. What I perceive is not simply given. The act of perception involves the structure, the inner field within the organism. Okay. So getting back to Merleau-Ponty, he asks this question. He describes this situation of perceiving light. He says, let us suppose that it is the case that it is this like radically just given kind of situation, that I am not active. I am merely responding in a very kind of sense of strict causality to this like linear chain of events from the light that is the cause of my perception. This kind of perspective is what he calls realistic analysis. So keep in mind that this whole book is kind of exploring this spectrum between like extreme realism and extreme kind of idealism and subjectivity versus objectivity. Okay, so he says, let's explore what it would look like if that was the case. If realistic analysis was true. So he's going to describe this situation according to this realistic analysis. He says, the reflex is the action of a defined physical or chemical agent on a locally defined receptor, which evokes a defined response by means of a defined pathway. In this linear series of physical and physiological events, the stimulus has the dignity of a cause, and the organism is passive because it limits itself to executing what is prescribed for it by the place of the excitation and the nerve circuits which originate there. Common sense believes that one turns one's eyes in order to see. And then he says, not so according to this realist kind of thinking. He calls it realistic analysis. He continues, I perceive the position of the spot because my body has responded to it by adapted reflexes. In the scientific study of behavior, one must reject every notion of intention or utility or value as subjective because they have no foundation in things. So again, he's just painting a picture of what this perspective suggests. He's not saying this is his perspective. He says the idea of norms or the normal activity of an organism, he brings that up. He says the normal activity of an organism is only the functioning of this apparatus constructed by nature. Notice that word nature because it's one of those fundamental kind of sides of the spectrum, like nature and thing versus consciousness and mind. So he says, and in this line of thinking, there are no genuine norms. There are only effects, just strict causality, cause and effect. The classical theory of the reflex and the methods of realistic analysis and causal explanation, of which the reflex theory is only an application, alone seems capable of constituting an objective and scientific representation of behavior. The object of science is defined by the mutual exteriority of parts and processes. Okay, so again, this is just a continued description of causality according to realistic analysis. And I just want to point out that in this book, as well as Kurt Goldstein's The Organism, as well as the talk on the address on Gestalt theory given by Max Wertheimer, which I have a video about, in 1924, at the heart of all this is the question of what is the nature of science? What is the perspective that science takes to truth? It's really connected to the question of truth theory. So I just want to point out that he's kind of talking about that here. So then he asks, might this perspective, this realistic analysis, be untenable? He says, might the opposition between a universe of science, entirely outside self, and the universe of consciousness defined by the total presence of self to self be untenable? So he says, is this kind of separation and opposition of complete objectivity and radical subjectivity, be an untenable position. He says, if realistic analysis fails, will biology find its method in an ideal analysis? Again, that idealism on the other side of the spectrum of the physical, mathematical type in Spinozistic intellection. Or might not value and signification be intrinsic determinations of the organism, which would only be accessible to a new mode of comprehension? And it would appear that that is going to be the argument that he makes. That's the conclusion that he's building up to. It's this kind of third way of integrating mind and nature, integrating value, meaning that arises from consciousness within an organism, that nature and mind can be seen within a unity, a unified organism. That was Kurt Goldstein's conclusion. So again, I want to never fail to point out that when a certain idea was seen in this book, already seen in Kurt Goldstein's book, The Organism, because it's very important. And to be quite honest, as much as he cites in his notes in this book studies and quotes that he makes from Goldstein and other Gestaltists, I don't know if he was clear enough that his very ideas so central to this book throughout it do come from Kurt Goldstein. I think that there may be a lack of clarity for the reader that these are not ideas that are just super original to Merleau-Ponty, as important as he was and as much as he did build on these ideas in his own way. In his next book, I do want to acknowledge just how much came from Goldstein. So he does have here a full quote from Kurt Kafka, Gestalt theory co-founder, and it's just describing this atomistic, reductionistic view of kind of the person as just a sum of reflexes, of a situation as simple stimuli and response. This is not Merleau-Ponty's perspective, but he's just using this quote to kind of describe the implications. It says, now instinctive and even most of reflexive activity appears to be highly adapted. The animal does what is good for it in its environment. But from the point of view of this theory, kind of classical theory, this adaptiveness is not a property of these actions themselves, but is instead a mere impression which they give to the onlooker. The actions are not determined in any way by the intrinsic nature of the situation, but altogether by these pre-existing bond devices. The situation enters only as an agency which turns the key, presses the button, makes the machine go. But like a true machine, the animal can only act according to the system of pre-established bonds, whether such an action be adequate to the circumstances or not. The relationship between situation and response is consequently purely contingent. So again, Gestalt wants to say this is inadequate. Gestalt theorists want to say there is an intrinsic kind of nature or order that we can see in how an organism acts in a situation according to its needs. It makes meaning. It has meaning according to which it's going to act. And Goldstein says it's going to self-actualize. It has a sense of relative purpose. It's not an absolute essentialist kind of perspective, but there is some kind of nature or quality of the organism. It's not a simple stimulus and response. Okay, so in this part, Merleau-Ponty is talking about an organism's ability to have functional reorganization. There's a lot of this part of the book that cites like research that's done on things like amputations. When we remove a part, how does the organism resume the same kind of process but uses its parts in a different way to still meet that same need? This was exactly what we saw in Kurt Goldstein's book, The Organism, many similar studies. Kurt Goldstein researched trauma, veterans who had brain trauma brain injury, and also saw things like amputations. How does an organism kind of reorganize in order to take the required action to meet its needs, even if the part itself is removed, or if in a different part of the system were acting on the organism? How does that change the organism's process? Okay, so he says, functional reorganization, as well as the putting into effect of substitute actions in which a member or an organ takes upon itself the function of another, takes place in a characteristic manner only if a vital interest is at stake, and not if a made-to-order act is involved, which is to say that it represents the means of a return to equilibrium for the whole nervous system, and not the releasing of a local anatomical device. So much like Goldstein said, Merleau-Ponty saying, we observe that organisms, particularly paying attention to the nervous system, they're able to still meet a need even if the first way that they would try to do it with their right arm, if that's inhibited, they can still, as one system, kind of pivot, and they can try to meet that need with their other arm, for instance. That's kind of like a substitute action, or reorganization is like an amputation. He says that that's not properly accounted for in a kind of such a strictly causal stimuli response reflex focused perspective of the realists. He says there is a directed activity between the blind mechanism and intelligent behavior, which is not accounted for by classical mechanism and intellectualism. Again, this is indicating that he sees a need for a third way. There's some kind of in-between realm between just blind mechanism in an organism and more conscious, concerted, intelligent behavior, which is not accounted for by these two kind of camps on either side of the spectrum. It's not just like consciousness in the sense of like humans have consciousness in a different way maybe than other animals do. So animals, we see the same ability, that it's almost on like a subconscious level. They're able to reorganize or take a substitute action to meet their needs, like a vital interest of theirs, such as, anything that works towards their survival and their ability to self-actualize. They will do it, and it's not just that they're sitting there thinking, okay, I'm going to do this. So it's something in between strict cause and effect and more intelligent behavior. Okay, so on page 42, this is a quote that entirely comes from Kurt Goldstein. The contribution of any part of the retina to the total performance changes according to the task with which the organism is confronted, and according to the kind of adjustment which the specific situation requires. Sorry about the typo. Okay, and so he says we need to pay attention to the specific situation which the organism is in. It's, again, a lot of this is just kind of like, it's more complex than this other option that people are presenting, the simple stimulus response. Okay. Next quote. Since our least conscious reactions are never isolable within the whole of nervous activity, since they seem guided in each case by the internal and external situation itself. Again, that's this idea that within me there's a structure, there's an internal set of conditions, as well as external environmental conditions that are acting in a given situation. And capable up to a certain point of adapting themselves to that which is particular to it. It is no longer possible to maintain the sharp distinctions between reflex activities and instinctive or intelligent activities within which the classical conceptions established theoretically. An opposition cannot be set up between a blind automatism and an intentional activity, whose relations with the former would moreover remain obscure. So this is again kind of very similar to the quote on the previous slide. He wants to find a third way between separating these two options, a way of integrating and connecting reflex activities with kind of like higher behavior. And hopefully I'm describing that well. He says he connects instinct with intelligence. So I may not have, in the previous slide, I may not have done it justice, but to this idea of intelligent activities, but it seems like it's kind of this idea of some kind of higher behavior contrasted with kind of blind mechanism. So doing my best to kind of describe those two sides of the spectrum, but I guess he describes instinct as well with that idea of intelligence. Okay, so the next thing he says is there is a reason that we observe and some have been led to believe in kind of focusing on reflexes as parts that we can just kind of build, and we can build these simple reflexes to understand an organism. He says that's not my point of view, but there's merit to this idea that there are parts. And this gets a bit philosophical here. He says, Gestalts are relatively self-enclosed. So I'm paraphrasing what he's going to say, and then I've got a direct quote here in the second bullet point. But on page 43, he's referring to Gestalt theory and its founding principle of a whole that is more than the sum of its parts. And Gestaltists have really established themselves as a third way between kind of, I'll read the quote that says this, but those who just see like the absolute unity of all of nature, of the whole universe as one, and those who are much more mechanistic and seeing things as just like mechanism, atomism, just everything is reducible to its parts. Gestalt theory is kind of this third way that says there are wholes, but there are many wholes within the universe. It's not absolute, but there can be said to be fields where there is a system there and it's relatively self-enclosed. Yes, everything can kind of be technically said to be connected to everything else, but when it comes to actually like important influences, some things, some holes out there, out in like left field, do not apply to this situation. So some factors are negligible. That's kind of Gestalt theory in a nutshell. And this is what Max Wertheimer says in his essay on truth. Okay, so I'll read the quote from Merleau-Ponty. He says, if everything really depended upon everything else in the organism as well as in nature, there would be no laws and no science. Gestalt theory stands at an equal distance from these two camps, from a philosophy of simple coordination, mechanism, atomism, and a romantic conception of the absolute unity of nature, which might be, it might be different kind of words for that, but those who see everything as radically just one. Gestalt is important because it proposes this third way between those. And so he says reflexes can tell us important things. It's just that taking that too far becomes atomism, becomes reductionism, mechanism, that to a point it does not accurately describe the human person or the organism accurately. So he just continues with this quote. He says, Gestalt theory attempts to distinguish. This book, the translation, the word here is true. I think that it's the idea of realistic analysis. So it said true analysis, but I think he's describing realistic analysis, which treats them all as things, that is, as wholes gifted with absolute properties, and which does not respect the partial structures in which they are integrated. So he's continuing to describe how Gestalt theory finds this third way. It is not taking this view that all things, that wholes are absolute. It does respect that there are different ways of seeing a whole. There are wholes within other wholes. So yes, there are parts within a whole. And those parts do exist. It's just that to really understand the whole, we have to look at it as a whole and not reducible to the parts. But the parts can be important to think about as parts. So he applies that to the reflex. He says, the reflex, as it is defined in the classical conception, does not represent the normal activity of the animal, but the reaction obtained from an organism when it is subjected to working, as it were, by means of detached parts, to responding not to complex situations, but to isolated stimuli. So that's the classical view of the reflex, which again is not his perspective. All right, we have a very important quote here, which has the title of the book in it. So I'll just point out that much like Kurt Goldstein was asking what is the object, the mission of the field of biology. That's what this quote is about. Merleau-Ponty says, the object of biology is to grasp that which makes a living being a living being. That is not, according to the realist postulate, common to both mechanism and vitalism, the superposition of elementary reflexes, or the intervention of a vital force, but an indecomposable structure of behavior. All right, so there's a lot to unpack here. So he says what is shared by both the mechanists and vitalists is this inevitable idea that there is some intervening vital force, which is what makes something a living being, or which makes it orderly. We'll talk about order in a little bit. But he says that these both kind of have realist ideas inherent in them, versus the Gestalt principle of a whole that is not reducible, it's indecomposable. He says what is key to the object of biology, to determine what makes something a living being, it has a structure, and it's not reducible. So it has a structure of behavior. So we'll talk more about that, but that is his thesis of this book, I would say. He says, in summary, the critique of reflex theory and the analysis of a few examples show that we should consider the afferent sector of the nervous system as a field of forces, which express concurrently the intra-organic state, so within, and the influence of external agents. These forces tend to balance themselves according to certain modes of preferred distribution, and to obtain movements from the mobile parts of the body which are proper to this effect. All right, this is a long but important quote, and this is where he's proposing the term forms. And he says that this is just what he's getting from Gestalt theory. It's already been proposed by the Gestaltists, this concept of form. He says the key to rise above these binaries, this dichotomy, is the idea of form. So I'll just kind of read through this quote. He says, it is not a question of one hypothesis among others, but of introducing a new category, the category of forms, which, having its application in the inorganic as well as the organic domain, would permit bringing to light the transverse functions in the nervous system of which Werther speaks, and whose existence is confirmed by experience, without a vitalist hypothesis. So the Gestaltists are not fans of being vitalists, and Merleau-Ponty shares in that. For the forms, and in particular the physical systems, are designed as total processes whose properties are not the sum of those which the isolated parts would possess. So that's important. He's defining form much as the Gestalt. It's the same thing. A Gestalt is a whole which is not reducible to the sum of its parts. The properties of the sum are not those which are possessed by the isolated parts. Excuse me. Okay. More precisely, they are defined as total processes which may be indiscernible from each other, while their parts, compared to each other, differ in absolute size. In other words, the systems are defined as transposable wholes. We will say that there is form whenever the properties of a system are modified by every change brought about in a single one of its parts, and on the contrary are conserved when they all change while maintaining the same relationship among themselves. It's very much just the whole idea of Gestalt theory, as defined by Max Wertheimer, as founded by him. The idea of the Gestalt had preceded Max Wertheimer, but this is how he had defined it. A whole is different than the sum of its parts. So in some of the examples of Max Wertheimer, the idea of a melody, you can see a pattern that is not just dependent on the notes, but you can see the same kind of relationship even when it's transposed among different parts. I know that's kind of hard to understand. I'm just going to kind of try to describe that. That's exactly what he's saying here. And so he's going to use the word form. And this concept of form is going to be an extremely important term in this book. And he says, this is just exactly what comes right after that. Just wanted to separate it here on the slide. He says, these definitions are applicable to nerve phenomena. So he says, nerve phenomena do act in this way. They are wholes. There is a unity there. And we're going to see that in one of the next slides. We're getting to the end. These are the last couple pages of this part of the book. And what he then says is this kind of like other voice, like a proposed kind of argument from someone else who might say, but problems of order can be rejected as anthropomorphic. So that Gestalt theory might be dismissed as being too anthropomorphic. It says, if Gestalt theory is not vitalist, it would nevertheless introduce anthropomorphism and finality into physics, as well as into physiology, by the very fact that it projects human norms into phenomena and supposes directed or ordered processes. So just going to pause there. That's kind of this idea that Kurt Goldstein, that as a kind of one of the Gestalt camp, he is proposing this idea of like preferred behavior. So someone who is a very realist perspective might say, okay, well, now you're kind of infusing something subjective into it. You're infusing values, ordered processes, direction. There's some kind of value being put in this equation. He says, it is clearly evident that in speaking of a response adapted to the stimulus or of a succession of coherent movements, we are expressing relationships conceived by our mind. So there's something subjective here. A comparison made by the mind between the meaning of the stimulus and that of the reaction, between the total meaning of the response and the partial movements which compose it. These relationships of meaning by which we define order result precisely from our own organization. So this is like a proposed kind of argument that, oh no, we're inserting the mind into nature. We're trying to integrate mind and nature, these two sides of the spectrum. So he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but here he's saying that according to someone who sees things in a realist way, they do not allow for the idea of preferred behavior because it is observed by our mind. It's this kind of value or meaning which is imposed by the mind. If we note that there is a pattern of behavior, frequently occurring preferred behavior, that can only be noticed by the mind. Last bullet says, for frequency is still in observation, and I think it's supposed to say an observation of our mind. In things, there are only singular events, which must be accounted for each time by particular causes. If the ordered behavior is maintained, it is because it alone is possible. So that word possible, causality, strict causality is the implication of the realist view. Every particular situation is radically defined by that situation. You can't just carry over a pattern and see the pattern, basically. With the realist perspective, you have to always ask, what is the stimuli that are determining the behavior in this situation? It's kind of strict causality. Merleau-Ponty says on page 50, the genesis of the whole by composition of the parts is fictitious, and that is the whole guiding principle of Kurt Goldstein as well. He says parts exist, we can notice parts, but we cannot simply build the whole by stacking the parts together. It's just this kind of guiding philosophical principle that they share, that is the Gestalt perspective. Okay, and so then he talks about unity and wholeness in the nervous system. He says each chronaxy is but one aspect of the total process. It is by abstraction that it is treated as a local event. In the nervous system, there are only global events. So this just means in the nervous system, it acts as a whole. It cannot just be reduced with an atomistic perspective. The unity of nerve functioning is an objective characteristic of that functioning, and is more particularly that unity of reciprocal determinations which distinguishes it from simply circular phenomena. To conceive of it as a result, that is, to derive it from the multiplicity of local phenomena in which it is immanent, is to break up this unity. By this very procedure, moreover, the return to an external principle of order is rendered inevitable. So to explain what this means, he's saying that it is inevitable that some kind of external principle, a vitalist kind of conception of things, is inevitable when you break up one into parts. You have to retain the unity of nerve functioning of the nervous system. So he says, I'm paraphrasing, where do we locate order? Order is either seen immanently in a whole's unity, or it will be accounted for by an external principle. If we see in an organism such kind of blind mechanism, that does not account for an orderly kind of pattern of behavior. That's not accounted for in the realistic analysis view, in the kind of radical mechanistic view of things. So that's why that's why he said it's shared among the mechanists and the vitalists, this idea of we need something that brings order into the universe, into the human person. They're going to try to impose some extra thing into the equation in order to account for that order. And that has been the perennial debate among the Gestaltists since the beginning of Gestalt theory and other camps. How do we account for order? Some want to kind of label this other thing as a regulating principle of order, a god, a soul, these different ideas, versus the Gestaltists want to see relatively immanent order. So it's kind of lofty to try to define that, but that's the idea. Okay. And much like Kurt Goldstein, Merleau-Ponty says that my idea is not strict essentialism. My idea of immanent nature or order is not the same as a strict essentialism, but it is descriptive. It's the best way of describing things, and that's what Goldstein said in his book. He says the notion of form, this is Merleau-Ponty, the notion of form does nothing other than express the descriptive properties of certain natural wholes. It is true that it renders possible the use of a finalistic vocabulary, but this possibility itself is rooted in the nature of the nerve phenomena. It expresses the type of unity which they achieve. Again, he's talking about how important it is to see unity of the nerve phenomena, as I said a few slides ago. He says, preferred behavior defines the organism just as objectively as chronoxic analysis can define it if, as is necessary, we renounce mechanistic realism along with finalistic realism. That is, if we renounce all the forms of causal thought. And these are the very last words in part 1 of this book. So he's saying that this notion of form is descriptive. I do not want to opt for a kind of realism as if there is a final cause in a realist way. He does not want to opt for mechanistic realism. But there can be said to be a nature of a thing. And that was what Goldstein said too. There's some kind of structure. There is an organization to a thing that we notice across time in different situations. There are preferences. And just as I conclude this video, this touches on just kind of existential topics. It really, the implication of this is the fact that humans have a sense of subjective values. They have their own meaning making. Their behavior is directed by the meaning that it has for them, whether it is to fulfill more basic needs such as hunger, safety, or whether it is to self-actualize in a more abstract way, such as if I want to be myself and to exert my values in the world, to shape my world. These are things that are descriptively helpful. They help paint a more accurate picture of what we observe in organisms and humans, whereas strict causality, simple kind of reflex perspectives, atomism, those things don't account for that kind of human dimension. And that's what a lot of this book is going to be about, is what sets humans apart, what are the different kind of orders of being. I don't know if that's the right word to put it, but the idea of hierarchy among different beings in the world, difference between humans and animals, that was also seen in Kurt Goldstein's book. So looking forward to starting part 2. It's a longer section, so I might not do all of part 2 next time, but we'll see what we can cover then. And thanks for tagging along. Bye.